Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Afternoon. Thank you both for coming, and hopefully there are more people online. I'm Yogesh Simhan from Indiana University. I work with Professors Dennis Gannon and Beth Paley on e-science, or broadly said e-science, but e-science covers a huge field. So through the talk, I'll describe more about the exact kind of projects that we work on, and more specifically, I'll be looking at some of the data management challenges that we've tried to address as part of the project that we've been doing. And in particular, I'll talk about how provenance can be used in the context of scientific data management to more effectively manage the huge amount of data that's currently being handled in this field. So just to briefly state the contributions that I've done through the course of my PhD work. I've tried to look at data management in an end-to-end perspective, starting with cataloging the data through discovering data, replicating it, tracking provenance, and looking at the data quality. So I see this more as a life cycle for the data. And one thing I haven't mentioned here is data archiving. I haven't looked at it yet, but that's something that I'd like to do down the lane. And in the context of this, one of the main research contributions that I see having come out of my PhD is my work done on data provenance. And as part of that, as part of my dissertation, I've developed a provenance framework, a standalone framework that exists by itself, is interoperable with different workflow engines, as we'll see. A framework to collect data provenance for workflows that can evolve over time, adaptive workflows, which I'll define, with a very lightweight schema, because you want it to be, you don't want a lot of overhead. So you try to keep it very lightweight so that it's more broadly usable and also has lower overhead, and the ability to satisfy the complex query requirements of the scientific domain. So what is e-science? So we are all familiar with how science, the way science is being done, has been evolving over time. So from theoretical to computational to from theoretical to experimental to computational, it's come a long way. And a lot of domains are moving into a primarily in silico way of doing science, where they don't really sit in wet labs like they usually used to do, but they're just sitting in front of their desktops or workstations or clusters and doing simulations, doing computational modeling of their science to see how to see if their hypotheses are accurate or not. And we've seen this in so many different domains. Earth sciences are a very popular field where this is happening, but also in biology and in astronomy, as we've seen in the Slow and Digital Sky Survey project. And all of them have very similar requirements that cause them to move, meaning that comes out of the computational aspect in large science. So they're all complex and dynamic systems in that the modeling that they do is not a trivial modeling that you can just sit in your laptop and code and run. It's going to be quite complex, and they go through various data flows. And when you're running on when you're running this huge computational code, they're going to be running on distributed resources. So the system has to adapt to the resources that are available at the present time the computation is running. And the data that's being pushed through the system is immense. So you have a lot of data being used, coming in from various sources, from various sensors all over the place. And these are being pushed through these systems, and even more, an exponential growth of data is taking place as more data gets created from all these various computations that take place. And yet another requirement is that it's getting multidisciplinary. So you have various groups that want to share data, that want to share ideas, and that has to be enabled by e-science. And you have hardware which is sort of trying to keep pace. So you have these huge supercomputers that are being deployed by the federal government through various universities, and the bandwidth that's available, especially as part of Internet 2 and the Lambda rail systems, it's quite a lot. And similarly, the ability to store data and archive them for a long time is also there. So as far as hardware goes, things are keeping pace. So that's not where the problem is. The problem comes more on how to use these hardware resources, and that's where grid middleware comes. So when I talk about cyber infrastructure or grid middleware, I'm talking about the same thing, on being able to use these large computational and data resources through a simple and easy way for the use of science. And the middleware uses a service-oriented architecture to enable it, so that all the various resources that are available are virtualized as at a higher level, so that you have a transparent way of accessing it. So over here we have a slide of how the typical cyber infrastructure stack looks like. They're also called science gateways. So you have all the hardware resources right at the bottom. You have computer resources, mass storage, data resources, and you have instruments and sensors collecting data from across the domain out there in the real world, pushing data in. And you have a virtualization layer that's built on top of all these hardware resources so that you can interact with them in a standard manner. And the Open Grid Services architecture is one of these standards that are being pushed in the grid world. These allow you to interact with these resources in an easier way. For example, you have security services that give you ability to do a single sign-on authorization to the entire system. So you have a single grid certificate, you authenticate yourself, and you can use any of these resources through the other endpoints. And similarly, you have execution management services that allow you to submit jobs to clusters and track these jobs and how they progress, what kinds of resources they're using, and when they complete, and so on. And then you have the data services, which allow you to do things like grid FTP, which allows you that transfers data securely within the organization. That's part of the virtual organization, as it's called. And on top of that, the virtualized resources, you have some core services that are deployed in the cyber infrastructure that are being used by all the scientists. So you have these are high-level user-facing services. For example, you have a resource registry that keeps track of all the various services that are currently running in the cyber infrastructure. You have workflow engines which run their experiments, and you have catalogs which record the data that are created by the users, so that they have a personal record of all the experiments that they have done in the form of almost like a lab notebook that you would have on paper. And a common interface to all of this is through a portal server. So this is the user's desktop on the grid. So this is a very common architecture that you will find in many of the eScience projects. So this is almost a recap of the previous slide. So you have portals which are user-facing that allow collaborations, and you have these scientific experiments, that the computational science experiments, they're modeled as workflows. So instead of having a huge script which would do all the work for you, you instead split them into building blocks which can then be composed into workflows, and these provide the scientists a lot of flexibility in the kinds of experiments they can compose and run on the fly. You have, again, since it's a service-oriented architecture, you have most of these applications that you find are effectively wrapped as services. So this allows you to invoke a Fortran code irrespective of where it's running. It might be running on a certain host in a certain machine, but the fact that it's wrapped by a web service allows it to be used in any workflow that you have, and you can run an experiment through the service interface. And finally, the challenge that we have, that I'll be talking about more, is the data and metadata management. So here is where I see a lot of the problems that are still yet to be addressed. And this runs all the way from cataloging and discovery to access and tracking the data and sharing the data and archiving. So this is a problem both due to the complexity of the data that's being produced, the scale at which it's being produced, and the very distributed nature of the entire data. So there's almost an entire class of applications called distributed data applications that satisfy, that have many of these data challenges. And what do I mean by end-to-end data management? So you have the source of the data. These could be coming from various sensors that are deployed. This could be coming from let's say, instruments that are being that you're recording with. And these are available at public repositories. Let's say the USGS sends out spatial data information, and that's available at public catalogs. And these need to be ingested in a form that's usable to your particular domain. And at the same time, we have catalogs for recording data that's being produced by your own experiments. So these are public and private catalogs that are available to that particular virtual organization. Similarly, once you have the data, you need to be able to search the data and pick the one that's most appropriate for you. And here's where the discovery process comes in. So the fact that you have so many different data sources means that it's going to be increasingly more difficult to find the right one that you need for your application. And in this case, the application is going to be the workflow that's going to be running your experiment. And then as the experiment is running, you need to be able to track the data as it goes through the various stages, and you need to track the various data that's being created from the workflows. And similarly, you need to also be able to track the usage of the data, because since it's a collaboratory environment, the data that you create might be used by someone else, some other scientist in a completely different organization, and you need to be able to track the usage also, in case you have to protect your intellectual property and so on. And finally, once the data has been created and you've used it for the immediate purpose, you need to be able to archive it so that down the lane, let's say 5 years down the lane, someone wants to, let's say, look up your publication and see if the results you have are really accurate. They need to be able to pull that out, and they need to have sufficient metadata to understand what you really did and verify if that was really correct.
If the data is not public, it still applies, right?
Oh yes, it definitely does. So it could just be something as simple as, let's say, you move out of the organization and someone else takes your place, and they need to look at your experiments and see if it was valid. So as long as, and even if it's the same person, I don't remember what the kind of code I wrote 5 years back. So if I need to look at my code, I need to look at the comments that I've got in my code before I can understand it. So the metadata, the contextual metadata that goes with this data is almost like that. It's like comments, but it's of a more semantically meaningful form, so that it's not just, you don't have to look at it to understand it. It should also be machine understandable in that sense.
What about permissions issues? Are you going to touch on those? So I get data from physicians, and I sign something swearing that I won't ever show it to anyone else. So I can't, if I leave, the data has to leave with me.
Right. I'm not going to be touching on the security implications, because I feel that's almost an orthogonal problem that has to be solved on a more broad-based thing. It's not something that's really, it is specific to data, but it's also something that's encountered in, let's say, if you want to run some experiment on a certain resource. So security is almost runs parallel with most of the challenges that you find. And there are, and security is, this is a much more need for standardized security than there is for standardization in, let's say, the data management or the information field, because that's something that has to work across organizations. The trust that comes out of it comes through the fact that it's standardized. So I'm not going to touch on that, but that's definitely something that has to go hand in hand with all these solutions. So this is a slide from Bill Gates' keynote talk at supercomputing a couple of years back, and he mentioned the LEAD project in that, and how, as an example of a cyber infrastructure project. And a lot of the work that I've done is part of this LEAD project, which is essentially a meteorological project that's trying to look at weather as it develops and tries to do forecasting of weather in a accurate and speedy manner, so that something like what happened at Louisiana won't be repeated. You have sufficiently adaptive systems that can work on their own and work at a moment's notice, so that you can do much better science. And a lot of the work all the work I've done is part of this project, and so I'll be using that as a use case right throughout. So this is typically what a meteorologist would want to do as they run their experiments. So you have all these sensors that they have. They have radars, they have satellite data, they have information streaming in from aircrafts as they fly. They actually let out balloons a couple of times a day, so called Raven zones, that go up and measure the things like precipitation and air quality and temperature and so on. So you have something like 15 or 20 different streams of information coming in from various sources. And all of this goes through a process of what they call assimilation, so that it becomes usable for their applications. And there's a pre-processing stage where they do quality control, look for outliers and so on, tag them, and get them into a form that can be sent to the actual prediction system, which runs on huge clusters. This one is at Oklahoma. And then that gives out outputs which forecast for a certain region. And then the scientists study the results and then make further decision. But the problem with this is that it's extremely static. For example, this prediction could take anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, depending on the size of the spatial region that they're doing the prediction in. And they don't get any information till the whole thing has completed. So if you got some kind of tornado developing at a certain part of the United States and you're doing a forecast for the complete United States, it might be several hours down the line until the whole computation is finished before they can actually use it and then decide what to do. And what they would like to do is actually, let's say there's some interesting weather developing in Louisiana. They'd like to zoom in and start yet another workflow that focuses on that with a much more higher granularity data and does the thing all over again. So this is called ensemble runs of the experiment. So essentially try out different parameters, different spatial regions at the same time. But you want to do that only for places that are really going to be interesting. So the idea of the whole LEAD project is to make the forecasting more adaptive to current weather events. And that is, a lot of that is achieved through the various resources that I talked about, the science gateway that I talked about. So this is how a typical forecasting run would look like for the scientists. So this is this is an actual workflow that the scientists run on a day-to-day basis using the system as it currently stands. So the pre-processing step takes place. Each of these boxes, by the way, meaning all of them are yellow, but the ones on the right at the beginning are the data components, while the ones in the middle are each one represents a single service, an application service, which essentially wraps a Fortran code, which does the actual task, actual science. And these wrappers, the task of the wrappers, the web service wrappers, is to do things like data staging, data movement, and initializing the environment variables, and so on. And all of this is currently, before the LEAD project took off, it was being done by a 50,000 line piece of Perl code. So this entire workflow was a single huge Perl script that was doing all the staging and the data movement and invoking the Fortran code and so on. And the idea of the LEAD project was to take this code, split them apart into logical pieces that can then be composed in any manner that the scientist wants. So, and essentially do different kinds of more interesting science than is currently possible. And the lines that link the data and the service and between the services represents the data flow that goes on. So you go through a pre-processing step that takes place on the initial raw instrument data, and then the idea is to build a three-dimensional model of based on all the instrument data that you have. So you have 17 parameters or so, and all of that is incorporated into a single 3D model, which is then passed to the forecasting algorithm, and that spits out analyzed results in the form of, in this case, it's going to be in the form of PNG images, which are then converted into GIF images, animated GIF images that the scientists can then view. So by having this as a workflow, what you can essentially do is put in a data mining component somewhere here and have that analyze the results as they are streaming in, and have a feedback loop someplace at the beginning saying that if you notice something interesting, start off yet another workflow. So that's where the adaptive component comes in. So what looks like a static workflow can essentially be turned into a dynamic workflow by just adding a few more blocks here. And that's something that that's almost there. We still have a year and a half to go into the project, but we are getting close to doing that. So this is essentially the design phase where you have designed the workflow, and users can load up this workflow from a portal interface and then do the actual selection of the data that they need to give as input to the workflow. And so you have a spatial selection portlet where the users can select different types of data that they want to use as input to the workflow. Of course, you have metadata that goes as part of the workflow that tells the users the kinds of inputs that it will accept. That's there. But what I show here is actually a general purpose spatial search portlet. But the same is used for input to the workflow also. So once they select a region, they can select the type of data that they want, and then they click on search, and that's going to return a list of data products by searching the various data catalogs that we have as part of the system, and then allow the user to submit it as an input to the workflow. So I'll talk briefly about the data catalog that we have, because that's something Tom Barclay is working at San Francisco as part of the Terra server. As I mentioned, there are about 17 different data products that stream in from various sources, these like satellite and radar and so on. And these are distributed in a standard form called the Internet Distribution, Internet IDD, Internet Data Distribution. So that's a format that various institutions have for exchanging data. So all of this comes streaming in, gets dumped into some kind of data repository. And what they essentially were doing till we came along was looking up this directory, finding out what kinds of data they need based on the file names, because they were in some standard cryptic format, which the scientists understood, and hard-coded the location to these files in their scripts, which would then go on and run off on the various clusters. So what we wanted to do was build a catalog of all the various data sources, so that you could search for it from, in a more meaningful manner, from a nice portlet interface, so that you can give a spatial selection box over here, and it will only return data products that you need. You also have a temporal component here, because you want data for during a particular time, so that because you want the forecast to be based on that particular input data. So what I built was essentially a data crawling service that crawls through the various metadata catalogs available. These are published. There's an interface to publish the actual directory structure as an XML document. So the idea is to crawl these at certain periods of time and build an index of all the data products that are available, so that you get a single point where you can go and query for data products in a uniform manner. And we use the Lucene library for building our index, and I've essentially built spatiotemporal capabilities into the library because natively it only supports numeric and string formats. So this allows the user to do a multi-attribute search through this web service interface, and then you can essentially represent it through a nice visualization environment, like we saw earlier. And then once the input data has been provided, you then go off and launch the workflow, and the status of the workflow is going to be can be monitored through this particular interface called Expire, which is also the interface used for composing the workflow. So this gives you runtime information. And the list of status that you see here is something that we'll get into just in a couple of slides. And this is essentially the provenance for the various data products and for the various services as they're executing. This gives you the trail which each piece of data takes as it runs through the workflow. Yeah.
The various pieces here, are they specific to the data set which you work with, or are they like general? Any e-science project can use?
So the way the workflow system is designed is completely generic. So it can be and has been applied to other projects also.
So what are the common modules? Like, what is the nature?
So each of these services are essentially wrappers around an existing application. So you can come up with your own application, and you just need to fill out a small XML document, or you need to fill out a small form which will create an XML document. And this form is going to require you to specify what kinds of inputs you'll take as parameters to the application, and what kind of output you will get from it. And we create a web service on the fly based on the specification document. So you have a service which is out there to which you can submit the specification, and it'll create a web service instance for you at runtime.
So let me see if I understand this. So you have what you are providing really is an environment where I can write my own custom applications and wrap it around as a web service.
Right.
And you give me facilities such as provenance.
Right.
Those are the things which you provide.
Exactly.
The services which you provide.
Exactly. So the application itself, it's something that scientists provide.
I see. And the applications are what, like there is a relational form. How is data consumed? It's in tables?
So that's a good question. And in LEAD, we have primarily been looking at data in the form of files. So many projects it's like that, but there are definitely projects which look at data coming in as inputs to as relations in databases.
It could be files, but then it's generally a set of rows or something like that.
Internally, the files, for example, you have formats like netcdf or htfs. So these files are pretty much going to be huge arrays. In most cases, that's what they are, and they could, each of those columns could represent different kinds of sensor information. So one could be the temperature, one could be the precipitation, and so on. And you could think of each, and this would be for certain spatial regions over a certain period of time. So they represent a huge multidimensional array. And each application is essentially responsible for interpreting the input data, and the next one is responsible for consuming the output. So as the workflow completes, you also record the various data that are being derived from the workflow, and these are stored in the user's personal catalog. It's called the personal workspace, so that they can go back later and look at how these things were created. And a lot of these things are facilitated. Here again, you will see the list of status that you saw in the earlier screen. So a lot of these things are facilitated by the fact that you're collecting provenance. So you can almost think of these as different views that you have from the provenance information. So what is provenance? So if you look up the definition in a dictionary, it's going to define it as the history or pedigree of a work of art. So that's where the word originally comes from. It comes from the arts. And it's also the derivation and passage of an item, and that's sort of the key over here. So we look at data as being derived through a series of steps, and how it passes, how it's used down the lane also. So these are the two main components.
When you say data, you mean file?
Well, when I say data, I don't mean a file in this case. So in a LEAD case, we primarily deal with files. But most of it is adaptable to what we call, it should be an identifiable piece of information. So it could be a tuple in a database. And another requirement that we have, which is usually okay in at least the situations we have seen in, is that these are immutable pieces of information. Because if we see a change, it essentially means that it's gone through some process for the change to happen, and we need to record that process. So we look at the input to that process as being different from the output for the process, and the fact that it went through this transition is provenance that we collect. So defining data provenance, it's a form of metadata which tracks the derivation history of data over time, moving back in time. That's created by a workflow run. This is just for the eScience case where experiments are defined as workflows, and that's spread across organizations that are distributed across various domains and over a period of time. So it's not like the data is derived and you stop at that. You also look at data as it's used and goes on in the future, and that's where data usage comes in. So it's also forward in time. So you want to see how frequently your data is used, and there are interesting use cases for that. For example, if you found that one of your experiments, one of your analysis packages had a bug in it, and the results of it was used in several other workflows, then you would like to identify those future experiments which took place so that they could go and correct their inputs to and sort of rectify the error. Similarly, workflow trace is almost a different view of provenance. So you're looking at it as how a certain workflow executes during its lifetime. So that's the process view of provenance, while earlier data provenance is the data view of provenance. So why do we need provenance? And especially in the context of eScience, to see if the experiment completed successfully or not. So a lot of this is driven by the fact that science, almost experiments in science, are defined as something that's repeatable. So if you need the experiment to be verified by someone, it has to be repeatable. In most cases, it's not. It might not be possible in a non-deterministic system, but the rigors of science requires that it be you record what really went on so that you have information on that. So as a workflow is running, so these are complex systems. So the workflow that I described, the moment you send it to something like cyber infrastructure, the scientist doesn't really know where the actual applications are running. And that's a big, almost cultural challenge that we have to overcome. Because earlier on, they had their Perl scripts. They knew they were submitting it to a certain cluster, and things were fine. But now they're trusting the workflow system to submit it to whichever cluster is best suited at that particular point in time. And they have no idea where it's going to be running. But they don't like that fact. So the fact that you collect provenance is useful for knowing if the workflow ran correctly, if it did not, if it failed someplace, where it failed, what the current status was, and so on. Also for attribution and copyright, if you're going to be using someone else's data, you better know what the provenance was, because you might use it and later on find that it was copyrighted and you can't use the results you got from that. Similarly, you want to know if you're using a third-party data to know if the data quality is fine. And provenance can play a big role, as I will talk later, on determining, making an estimate of what the data quality is based on how it was derived. And similarly, it can be used for resource usage, monitoring, and so on. And I put an open system here because I was having a chat with Raman at SQL Group today. And I was telling him about how provenance can be used for e-science and how it can be used for business analysis. And he saw a distinct difference between the types of use cases I had for science and for business. So in science, many of the use cases were driven by the fact that data is open, that it's shared across people, and you're working with collaborators you might not really know. But in business, it's a closed system. It's within that enterprise. And the challenge, like the use cases are driven by that. So in a data warehouse, you would like to know what the various transformations took place to know how clean your data is. So if you had some erroneous source data, you might want to track that down and look at all the results that were generated from views that were based on that. Similarly, if you had auditing requirements, especially with regulatory requirements like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, you need to keep track of what kinds of transformations you make to business documents. So that's a major regulatory requirement. And you see workflows all over. You see business workflows came out of the business community. So science is actually a late adopter of that. So you already have business workflows, business processes, as they're called. And if you need to track provenance for these processes so that you know exactly who changed what at what point in time, and so on. Similarly, if you're in, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry, and when you're filing for a drug patent, then you better be able to prove that you got it through your own experimentation, and which is pretty much what provenance is. So I'll describe in more detail what the actual provenance framework that we have called the Karma system does. And to start off with, we have some basic assumptions on the kinds of workflows that we support. And the abstraction makes it easier so that we know that it's implementation independent. There are a couple of ways in which workflows can traditionally be composed. So one is the data flow model, where you have various pieces and you have data coming in as input and data coming out as output, which is reused in other pieces. So here, the idea is that data flows from one service to another. In an invocation flow, it's actually the data takes the second place as compared to what the invocation wants to do. So if you want to build, let's say, invoke this particular component, it depends on invoking two other components. This is almost like a procedural way of doing it. So if you want to invoke a certain function, and the function internally wants to invoke two other functions, so the idea is that the invocation flow takes precedence on top of data. The fact that it passes data here also is almost a secondary. It's almost a data typing problem at that point. Similarly, you can have workflows that are going to run in a centralized or a distributed manner. So in a central model, you have a single workflow engine that controls data transfer between various pieces in the service. It keeps track of all the messages that are passed. When in a distributed scheme, you could potentially think of one of these being controlled by a certain workflow engine, and the other piece being controlled by a different workflow engine, and control passes between these two pieces. So these are typically the kinds of models that you have at the higher level. So broadly speaking, workflows are directed graphs of services and nodes. And in data-driven applications, which we consider, all services that talk to each other always exchange data. So that's one of the almost requirements, because otherwise you could probably potentially think of configuration files being exchanged also, but they also form a certain form of data. And we have the idea of a hierarchical composition. So you have a workflow, and the workflow also behaves as a service which can be reused in a different workflow. So this allows you a lot of flexibility and gives you the idea of building blocks that workflows are. And yeah.
You had some edges where there were multiple outputs.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? That means that workflow produces.
So it means the data that's being produced is being used by multiple services. So you have ideas of forks, joins, iterative loops, and so on. So all of that is part of the model.
But it's a push-based model, right? So the data is pushed out.
That's actually an implementation artifact. The fact that whether it's, but in this particular case, you could data is produced. So
Okay, so and then
it's being sent to the next stage. So yeah, in that way, it is a push-based model, right? So, but over here, you could potentially think of it as a pull-based model in that you invoke it, and then this invokes the next service, and it's going to pull the data from that. So, and again, the workflow definition is not required. That's a very interesting requirement, in that several provenance systems that are out there actually require you to provide the provenance system with a workflow up front, and they essentially tag the workflow with additional information that they get from runtime. But we find that that's a very flawed requirement, because when you have adaptive workflows that can change over time, which react to external events, you might not really know what structure you really are going to be executing. So we prefer to collect provenance completely at runtime based on asynchronous notifications, as we'll see. So here are various workflow models. These essentially are examples of the previous abstract model. So you can have a workflow engine controlling two different services. So S1 and S2 are the service, with D1 going as input, D2 coming as output, which is reused in S2 and D3. So here the workflow engine actually controls the messages that, this is a centralized workflow engine. So this is going to control how the interaction is between these two. So the engine is actually going to be invoking service 1 with input D1, and it's going to get the output D2, and in turn it's going to pass the output D2 to S2 and get the result D3. So over here you can pretty much look at the workflow as a single building block. So you can take this and use it in a different workflow, and you have it acting as a service, which takes D2 as input and produces D4 as output. So this is a typical hierarchical composition that we support. So looking at the provenance model, so what would you record for a trivial workflow like this if you had data provenance for that? So in this case, data provenance is essentially, as we saw, the derivation history of data. So what process created it, and what are the inputs to the process, simply speaking. So in our case, the provenance model that we have consists of an invocation. For us, an invocation is essentially the starting point. And the invocation over here is the pair of these yellow and green block arrows. So an invocation consists of an invoker, which is the client, which invokes the service, and an invokee, which is a service, which is invoked by the client and does the operation in order to produce the output. And as part of this invocation, provenance records the fact that data products were produced. So data provenance is for a certain data, identifiable data, which is defined by the data ID over here. And this invocation used other data products as inputs. And you can potentially add other parameters also in addition to these data products. I only list data products because that's the one we are primarily concerned in. So data provenance relates the produced data to the consumed data. And as you see, this is extremely simple. It's extremely intuitive and extremely simple, because this is pretty much all you want. Because we see provenance as almost like a glue that ties various information pieces together. We don't see it as a metadata, comprehensive metadata solution by itself, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. You already have registries and catalogs and for recording metadata about, you have information repositories all over the place. So we see this more as a tool for information integration rather than a comprehensive solution by itself. So, and as I mentioned before, another requirement we have is that all data products are uniquely identifiable, and this is more easily achieved in the case of files, because you can people do keep track of the files. So the idea is to build a naming service on top of that, so you can keep track of various replicas that are available for a single UUID. It's a bit more complicated in the case of databases when you have mutable tuples. So here, immutability and the identifiability are requirements for the system. Just as data provenance describes a single invocation of a service in order to get the resulting data, you have a recursive definition of provenance, in that the inputs that were used to that particular invocation could themselves have, and frequently they do have, provenance. So essentially, provenance can also be thought as an inverted tree, with the recursive provenance, the data product being at the bottom of the tree, and you have services, service invocations, and inputs to the service, and their service invocations, and so on, sort of flowing back up. So the recursive model is essentially, the recursive data provenance is essentially a recursive model where you have just this additional edge that says this particular data product also has its own data provenance, which is a recursive definition. So data provenance was looking back in time. So looking forward in time, we define the information model for data usage as just being data that's used by 0 to n other invocations of services. So this keeps track of data as it goes forward in time. And a lot of this, so what you see here and what you see here, they're almost, a lot of this information is common. So if you look at invoker and invokee, these are shared information. So the idea is that though these models are different, the actual information that you use to generate these models at runtime is common. So, and I'll be talking about the actual backend database where all this information is stored a few slides down. But this is what we expose to the user when they want to do a query. When they want to do a query, they're querying for either data usage or data provenance or recursive data provenance, or let's say process provenance, where you want to know what was the result of invoking a workflow, or what was the result of invoking a service. Did it execute successfully? What inputs did it use, and so on. So this is a complementary view of data provenance, looking at it from a process perspective. So how do we collect provenance? So the idea is to take these workflows and services and instrument them with code that can generate pieces of this provenance graph. As I mentioned, we have these application service wrappers, and these wrappers are generated by defining, let's say, defining inputs to the application. So when these wrappers are generated, they're automatically instrumented to generate activities which describe the kind of action they're doing at a certain point in time. So if you look at a service invocation, the moment a service is invoked, it has code which publishes an activity saying that I have been invoked, and that's going to uniquely identify that particular service invocation in the form of the workflow it was part of, the actual service instance it was part of, and the location of the actual workflow node, which uniquely identifies the invocation both in space and in time. And similarly, so space is going to define which service is actually being invoked, and time is almost a logical timestamp that we assign to every invocation within a certain workflow invocation. And in case of recursive workflows, we also want to know the depth of the invocation. So is it right on top at the root, or is it going to be a level down or further on? Because you could have the same service being invoked as part of different workflows which are all part of the same hierarchical graph. The fact is, services could repeat. The same service instance could be invoked multiple times as part of the same workflow. But one of the other factors would change. So the time at which they're invoked is going to be different. The depth from the workflow route that they're going to be invoked is going to be different, and so on. And finally, we have an operation which takes place that describes the activity. So it could be a data consumed activity where they're using the data as input or they're producing a data as output. So overall, we have 14 activities which are defined through the life cycle of a workflow to collect provenance. So which are listed over here, almost in the order in which they are typically generated. Of course, terminator has to be down. So as soon as a service is created, it sends out an activity saying it's been initialized. When it's invoked, you have the concept of a client and a service. So a client has equal responsibility for generating activities. So we have two different views. So one is a client saying that these are the things I'm doing to certain services, while the service is going to publish activities saying these are the tasks that I am doing as part of my invocation. So before a client invokes a service, it's going to publish a notification saying that it's invoking the service gets invoked, and it's almost a three-phase protocol where the client invokes it before and after it invokes a service, publishes activities before and after. And as the service executes, it's going to publish notifications which say that it's transferring data, it's doing computation, it's using inputs and outputs and so on. Similarly, it goes through a response phase once the actual invocation has been completed. So this is a sort of sequence diagram for how an invocation could typically be. Let me jump over to a more meaningful example. So you have S1 and S2 which are being invoked by a certain workflow, which are being orchestrated by a certain workflow. And these are the sequence of steps that they go through over time. So this gives a list of all activities that the workflow is generating. The workflow engine acts as a client to the various services. And then you have the service S1 and S2 which are being invoked by this particular workflow. So initially all three of them are going to send out activities saying that they've been initialized, they're ready to start. And then the workflow is going to be invoked by an external client. So the fact that D1 is being passed to workflow is the initial invocation. And then it's going to start invoking the service S1. Before the workflow invokes S1, it's going to send a notification saying that it's going to invoke S1. S1, as soon as it receives a message, it's going to publish a notification saying it's been invoked. And then as soon as the invocation, the initial invocation, the request goes through, the workflow is going to send out a notification saying that the initial request has gone through. But the actual invocation still hasn't completed. It's almost an asynchronous way of invoking a particular service. And then as the service executes, it's going to be consuming data and producing data. So any input that the service gets as part of its input is data that's been consumed by the service. And once it finishes its computation, once it creates data products, it's going to be producing that, and it's going to record this fact. And the fact that you have a service application definition that is used to generate the service wrapper means that you can automatically instrument the service to generate these notifications, these activities, as soon as it gets an invocation and as soon as it finishes the computation. So once the computation is complete and the data has been created, the service returns control back to the workflow by sending the response message back, and at the same time also publishing an activity saying that it's finished successfully and it's sending a response. If this particular computation has failed, then the service S1 would send a message saying that sending response failed, and that would again be recorded. And the same goes on for the second stage where the workflow invokes S2 with D2 as input and gets D3 as output. And finally, the workflow, all the workflow, the service 1 and service 2 terminate. So these are the sets of activities that are produced during the invocation of this particular workflow. And these are essentially collected by the Provenance service in order to build the information model that we saw earlier, both the process and the data provenance information model. This is a more involved example which I'll skip. And this is typically how these activities look like, just to give you a flavor of how the implementation looks. So when the service sends a notification, sends an activity saying that it's being invoked, it's going to record information such as which workflow it is part of and what time step within the workflow it's being invoked as. The ID for the service, in this case this is a convert service that was invoked as part of a Provenance challenge that we participated in. And the description of the service, which could be a human readable form. And the actual message that the service received also. So we are talking about web services, so these requests are going to be in the form of SOAP messages, and so are the responses. So these might have some additional information, and this is particularly useful for replaying a workflow execution. So if you actually have the request messages and response messages that went in the wire, so you could recreate them by sending these requests, the same request at a later point in time. And then you also have the client which actually did the service invocation that is also identified by the workflow name. In this case, this was a brain workflow. This was a fMRI imaging workflow that we apply the Provenance system to. Likewise, the data produced activity that's going to be generated whenever a data product is created has the similar set of IDs which identify the invocation, as well as identifiers for the actual data product which was created as part of that invocation. And there are several ways in which these activities could be recorded. So we have a Provenance service which expects these activities. So it could be either published as notifications to a publish subscribe bus, and that's the model that we use because it allows us. It's got a lot of advantages, as pub subsystems are known to have. So it's loosely coupled, so the application doesn't have to worry about waiting for the Provenance service to receive these activities. It can just publish it to the message bus and move on. And the message bus essentially guarantees things like reliability and so on, the fact that it will be received. And moving on to the actual database where these activities are stored. So as I mentioned before, each of these activities are almost like an edge in the actual Provenance graph. So these are built as they arrive at the Provenance service. And the idea is to fill. So this is pretty much this is the database backend that we have, which is used to generate the information model that we saw earlier. So this is where all the information is going to be stored. And each of these are filled by the activities that are received by the Provenance system. So you can almost see a one-on-one mapping between each of these tables and the various blocks that we saw in the Provenance graph. And as far as disseminating Provenance information goes, there are several ways we do that. One is querying for the various Provenance models that we saw. We had 5 Provenance models, the data and process Provenance and so on. And you can do that by using the ID for your workflow or for your data or for your service. And we again have a web service interface to do that. And the results that you get are essentially an XML representation of the Provenance model, information model that I showed earlier. And we have showcased this particular system as part of one of the Provenance challenges, which are a series of workshops that are taking place by about a dozen or so Provenance systems that currently exist, in order to compare what their various capabilities are and to see if we are interoperable and so on. And the first Provenance challenge, which took place late last year, was to see what kinds of queries that each of these Provenance systems could perform. And we were able to do 8 out of the 9 different Provenance queries that are part of the challenge. And the reason we couldn't do the 9th was we purposefully didn't do it because some of that particular query, as one of the query also, was going into annotations that were stored as part of the Provenance. And we take the view that meaning Provenance is just the glue that ties information together. And if you start storing information as part of a Provenance, then you're going outside the scope of your work. And we purposefully didn't solve that query because it's almost like, well, these are challenges and these are just almost like position papers that you take. And this is the position that we took.
This process that you've outlined requires that these services somehow are aware, or the system is aware of the services
right.
The Provenance system. And I appreciate there's lots of applications where that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of other applications, though, where people use all these ad hoc tools that
Mm-hmm.
don't know about
Right.
the Provenance system. Is there any work being done where it's the operating system, or it's basically a wrapper around the operating system that just captures everything that you're doing, and ideally you want to have a little, like a terminal served into a separate place where you do all the work for your project, so that it's not recording all the emails that you're reading in between doing that.
Right.
So, is there any kind of is there work going on where ad hoc tools can be the use of ad hoc tools can be documented?
I'm glad you asked that question because I was going to address that as part of the related work, but I'll do that right now. So There are two ways in which you can handle that. One is let the operating system do all the recording, or at the operating system level do all the recording. Or one facility that we provide is to use libraries that we have for generating these provenance activities. So the idea is you can almost think of provenance, these activities, as a form of logging. And people use loggers all the time. So if you can essentially make the logging more semantically interesting and publish them as provenance, then the idea is to tie two different activities that you get from two different applications together as part of the same workflow. If the application has sufficient information of which workflow it's part of, then it can generate these activities through the library that we provide. It's a Java library, and we have shown this using Jython scripts that we used for wrapping. Instead of web services, we essentially had Jython scripts that wrap these Fortran code, and that's typically how like the Perl scripts that you have, that the scientists have. These are a very similar concept, and we have recorded provenance using that. The other solution is, like you said, something at the OS level. And there's a group, there are two groups who are working on this. One is Margot Seltzer's group at Harvard, and they have a system called PASS, the Provenance Aware Storage System, where they have drivers at the kernel level drivers which record all file I/O activities for every single process that is being executed. So if you think of the Fortran code that these scripts are going to invoke, the PASS system is going to record every file I/O that takes place as part of a Fortran invocation, every environment variable that was set when that application is being invoked, and so on. And the amount of data they collect is humongous. Meaning, they had the largest provenance dump amongst all other groups by far. So there are different levels at which you can collect provenance, and I see that as vertical integration of the various provenance systems. So you have provenance at the level of workflows, where all you're concerned about services, and then you have provenance at the level of the OS and the storage system, and all of them are tied together because it's the same workflow which is going to invoke a web service, which is going to invoke a script, which is going to invoke the Fortran code, which is going to make a Unix system call or a Windows system call. So all of them are tied together, and if they are aware of their parent up here, and they can tie them together in the form of some kind of correlation, then you can collect it at different levels and tie them all together at a later point in time. So does it answer the question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I've got to take off soon. I don't know if you want to
Yeah, I'll probably
summarize soon.
yeah. So this is the broad architecture of the provenance system. We have a provenance service which listens to all these activities which are published by the various services in the workflow engine, and we have a notification bus which enables this pub/sub system. And we have done some scalability studies on the provenance system that has been presented before, and we have found that the overhead for collecting provenance is insignificant compared to the size of applications that we have. It was in the order of under 1 to 2% of the total application runtime. And we found that the system scaled quite well to, in one of these experiments we had about 68,000 activities that were collected from the provenance system as the experiments ran, and we found linear or sublinear scaling of the system. So I'll talk about one application of provenance, and then that will be the end of my talk. So data quality is a challenge that we see as being increasingly more relevant as time goes on. As this number of data products increase, it's going to be harder and harder to find the most relevant data for your application. And it's intuitive to see how provenance, how the way a data was created, having an effect on the quality. So the work that I did as part of my dissertation, that's based on provenance, is to come up with a set of metrics that will help you quantitatively evaluate the quality of data for a certain application that the user has. So the idea is to let the users define a set of requirements based on metrics that we provide, and evaluate these metrics for the user so that when they do a search, they get results, and you can rank these results based on the quality. So this is the broad outline of the metric that we use. So you have an overall quality score that is defined over 4 different quality metrics. One is the intrinsic metadata, which is the core metadata that describes a certain data product. For example, the publisher of the data, the spatial extent and temporal extent for the data, and so on, in the case of Earth Sciences domain. Then you have the provenance quality score, which is the estimate that the provenance system gives you of the quality of a data based on the quality of the input data that went into creating it. And then you have the idea of quality of service, especially in a distributed environment. If you've got multiple copies of the same data, you want the fact that you can get to a data when you're running your experiment is critical. So you might have a wonderful quality data, but it might be in a network which is not currently available, but which means that it's virtually not of use to you. And if you've got a collaborative environment, especially in the case of LEAD, where you have scientists and who use the system, as well as K-12 students who are also supposed to use the system, then you'd like some kind of knowledge transfer between the two, which is why we try to incorporate the community perception of data. As scientists use the data, they can give feedback on how they found the data, and others can use that feedback to drive their metrics. So the key contribution that we had was an ability to essentially take samples of various runs of workflows. And based on the samples we got, we came up with a functional model for describing the quality of a certain service. So based on machine learning techniques, meaning I was just a user of various machine learning algorithms, we were essentially able to come up with a function. Given the input qualities and the configurations parameters given to a particular service, we could predict the quality of the output of the data even before running the workflow or the service. And this is pretty much the architecture of the quality broker that we have. And other simpler applications of provenance has been to monitor the workflow during runtime. This is extremely useful to see the progress of your experiment as it's running on distributed resources. And similarly, we have a sort of information environment, integration environment, where you can start off with provenance and essentially look at various other metadata available for a certain data products, using the provenance as almost a navigation tool to various pieces of the workflow and across workflows. So this is the related work. As I mentioned, the provenance-aware storage system is the work done by Margot's group. And they do it at the system level, but there's still no linkage with the higher level concepts. And if that's present, I think it'll be great. And that's a wonderful area of research. And again, everything is in the form of processes, so they don't have any concept of workflows and so on. There's work being done by Roger Barga at over here. And he's done Provenance Collection for Windows Workflow Foundation. And that's in many ways it's similar to the work we've done in that he uses events to collect provenance while we use activities. But again, it's sort of limited to being run in the Windows Workflow Foundation. We take a more broader view. And there's also work that goes on at collecting provenance at the database level as part of the TRIO project, where they're looking at how various tuple transformations can be recorded so that you can go back and find out how the views were generated. So there's a lot of provenance is a new field, and there's more work to be done, and that's good for us. So one is on how we can use provenance for doing things like workflow composition. So if you have workflows if you have a database of the provenance for various workflows, when you're composing new workflows, you can essentially aid users in the composition based on past information. And on data preservation, when you want to store workflow data for tens of years, provenance would be an important part of the metadata that goes with this particular data. So in summary, I described the Karma provenance frameworks, its uses, how we implemented it, and how we applied it to the LEAD project. And to summarize, I always like to think of provenance as almost being a silent spectator out there. So this is a quote that some of you might be familiar. If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And I don't want data to be like that. So unless you have someone listening to the data and looking out for it, it's as good as not there. And I hope provenance will fit that role. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll take that right now.